The alien flagship Tavarak hung above Earth like a silver blade in the sky, its vast shadow passing over oceans and cities, while millions of human eyes turned upward to watch news channels cut between shaky camera feeds and expert panels filled. With nervous voices, the Tavarians had arrived and the world was holding its breath in orbit inside the gleaming corridors of the Tavarak. Tall, thin figures moved with smooth precision, their pale limbs long and delicate, their armor made of shimmering scales that caught the light. Their voices carried a strange musical echo as they spoke in their own language, laughing at the primitive blue world below. To them, Earth was a backwater, its people slow, heavy, and unrefined in the grand stadiums of the Tivari Empire warriors could leap 3 stories in a single-bound dance across steel beams like feathers in the wind, and shatter stone with their bare hands, compared to that humans were clumsy, earthbound creatures weighed down by their own. Worlds pull. When the United Nations received the first transmission from the alien Captain Velrix, the image filled every screen on the planet. His narrow face stretched into what might have been a smile, though his eyes glittered with the cold pride of a conqueror. He spoke in perfect English, as if mocking the need for translators. "We offer you a place in our empire. Serve us or be replaced." And then he laughed a laugh that rolled through the comm channels and into every human home, a sound that carried the weight of superiority in the control room of the UN headquarters. Human generals stared at the broadcast, their jaws tight, their hands clenched on the table. They had fought wars among themselves for centuries, but this was different. These were not neighbors across borders. These were strangers from the stars, and they had arrived not to share knowledge, but to demand obedience outside crowds gathered in streets, craning their necks toward the sky, trying to see the pinprick of light that was the Tavarak against the sun. Reporters filled the airwaves with speculation, some speaking in awe, others in defiance, while in a quiet corner of the room, a woman in a white lab coat sat back in her chair and watched the alien feed. Without a word, her name was Dr. Alara Sloan, a gravitational physicist whose life's work had been dismissed as too theoretical for real defense. Yet now her eyes stayed fixed on the slender figures moving in zero gravity. Their easy grace, their long steps, she saw, not beauty, but weakness. It was subtle, hidden under layers of confidence, but she knew. And the thought made her lips curl just slightly, that the moment they stepped onto Earth, the planet itself would become her weapon. The next day, the Tavarians sent another broadcast this time, showing their warriors in action on the Tavarak. They moved like living blades, their movements blurring as they leapt across vast chambers, swung from cables, and landed without a sound. The human soldiers watching from Earth could only stare, their own drills suddenly seeming slow in comparison. Captain Velrix addressed the cameras again, his tone dripping with contempt. "Perhaps we have misjudged you. Perhaps you are not even worth conquering. You move like stones rolling uphill in your gravity. How have you survived in this galaxy?" His crew roared with laughter in the background, some even mimicking the short, heavy human stride in a cruel pantomime. The insult was heard across the globe, in army barracks, in homes, in bars, and on every screen. Yet in that same UN room, Dr. Sloan leaned forward and said in a voice just loud enough for the military commander beside her to hear, "Invite them here." The commander turned to her, brows raised. "Here on Earth," she nodded. "If they wish to test our strength, let them come down." Velrix would never refuse. He was too certain of his superiority. The commander hesitated, then smiled a slow, dangerous smile, and when the reply was sent, the alien captain accepted without a moment of thought, not knowing that the very air, the very ground, and the invisible pull that held oceans in place would become the greatest trap they had ever stepped into, the planet itself, waiting silently beneath their feet. The invitation was sent as a gesture of peace, but beneath the polite words was a quiet challenge that neither side openly named. The Tavarians believed it was a formality, a chance to further display their unmatched agility and strength before these heavy, slow humans, while for the humans it was the first step in a plan. Only a few truly understood the agreed-upon event would be a demonstration, a series of friendly games to show the might of each species, and perhaps open the door to diplomatic talks, though no one on either side truly believed in peace. Yet Captain Velrix accepted instantly, his pale lips curling in satisfaction as he sent his reply. "We will show your people the difference between stone and lightning in a great stadium. Built for the occasion, cameras and lights were arranged so that every corner of the planet could watch. Millions would see this and remember it for generations. On the day of the games, the Tivarak's shuttle descended through the clouds like a gleaming spear, its hull catching the sunlight. Crowds in the stadium gasped as the ramp lowered, and the Tivarian warriors stepped out tall and impossibly thin, their armor glittering, their movements smooth and fluid even under Earth's pull. Now they seemed only slightly slowed as they crossed the platform to the cheers of their own crew, who watched from orbit. The human team stood at the opposite side of the arena. Soldiers trained for years in every harsh condition on Earth, broad-shouldered and steady-eyed, their boots planted firmly on the ground. They wore no gleaming armor, only simple combat gear marked with their nation's flags. To the Tivarians, it was almost laughable. Velrix stepped forward to address the crowd in flawless English. "Today we test your strength against ours today. You will see the future of your world." The games began with a high jump, and here the Tivarians truly shone. They leapt higher than any human could manage, their limbs bending and extending. Like springs designed for the stars, the crowd gasped and murmured, but then the weightlifting began, and the change was subtle. But there the humans excelled, lifting steel bars and massive weights with steady power, while the Tivarians struggled. To maintain balance under the strain, one of them dropped his weight mid-lift, his thin legs trembling under the invisible force pulling him down. Still, the alien captain laughed, masking the flicker of concern in his eyes. The next challenge was a sprint. The aliens shot forward fast at first, but each step seemed heavier than the last, their strides shortening, their breathing quickening. Humans caught up, closing the gap before the finish line. A murmur ran through the audience. Some saw it, others didn't yet. But Dr. Alara Sloan in the VIP box was already taking notes, her pen scratching quickly across the page. She had seen what she wanted to see. The next event was a climbing wall towering above the stadium here. Again, the Tivarians began strong, but midway up, they slowed, their fingers trembling, their movements less fluid, their chests rising and falling with effort. Humans overtook them, reaching the top with solid, powerful motions, not quick, not graceful, but unyielding. Every event became a quiet battlefield of endurance against elegance. The Tivarians began each one like gods, but ended them like mortals. As the hours passed, Earth's pull worked on them silently, unrelenting, wearing down their muscles, tightening their joints, making every motion a little harder. The alien captain still smiled, but now it was tight-forced. His warriors were proud. They would not admit weakness in front of these ground-dwellers, but the signs were there: a stumble, here a slip, there. Heavier breathing, a slower recovery time. The crowd watching from every home and public screen could feel it, though no one spoke it aloud yet. By the final event, a long obstacle course, blending, climbing, crawling, running, and lifting, the difference was clear. The Tivarians crossed the starting line, still elegant, but by the end, they dragged themselves across the finish panting, pale, and visibly drained. The humans finished strong. Their movements measured, their breathing steady. Velrix forced himself to clap as if impressed, but his eyes betrayed him, sharp and calculating, as they flicked toward Dr. Sloan, who stood watching without expression, only the faintest hint of a smile curling her lips, for she knew this was not the victory yet. It was only the beginning. The real test had not even started, and Earth had all the time in the world to finish what it had begun. The Tivarian shuttle touched down again 2 days later, this time not for a quick demonstration, but for a longer stay. The humans had offered what they called a cultural exchange, a week of shared training, shared meals and tours across different parts of the planet. The Tavarians accepted with confidence, seeing it as an opportunity to show even more of their superiority and perhaps to scout Earth's defenses in greater detail. Captain Velrix walked down the ramp flanked by his warriors, the air around them warm and heavy compared to the controlled climate of their ship. Their thin frames moved with practiced grace, but there was already a subtle drag to their steps that had not been there during the games. It was nothing obvious yet, and the alien captain dismissed it as the natural adjustment to local conditions. The human hosts welcomed them with open smiles, soldiers and officials shaking hands, cameras flashing as the aliens were guided to armored transport vehicles. The convoy rolled through the city streets, passing skyscrapers, markets, and crowds that lined the sidewalks waving flags. Some faces were filled with awe, others with quiet determination. Velrix kept his chin high, not noticing how his own warriors were breathing just a bit deeper than usual. The first stop was a training ground where human soldiers demonstrated drills in full gear, jogging, carrying heavy packs, crawling under barbed wire, and scaling walls. The Tavarians watched with polite interest, some even smirking until they were invited to try it themselves. At first they moved well, clearing obstacles with agile precision, but by the second lap something shifted. Their steps became shorter, their hands slower to grip the walls, their shoulders sagging slightly. The gravity here was constant, unchanging and inescapable, a force that pressed on their every movement. The humans moved in it as naturally as fish in water, while the Tavarians were like birds forced to walk miles through deep sand. After the training came a formal dinner in a grand hall. The Tavarians sat at long tables alongside human generals, diplomats, and scientists. The food was rich, heavy, and filling the kind of meal humans thrived on in their dense atmosphere, but it settled in the alien stomachs like stones. Velrix sipped water more often than wine, his long fingers twitching between bites. Dr. Alara Sloan was seated at the far end, quietly observing every motion she saw the subtle tremor in a warrior's hand as he reached for a glass, the faint stiffness in their necks when they turned to speak, the fatigue creeping in beneath their proud postures. On the third day, they visited a coastal military base where the humid air clung to skin and clothes. The aliens moved slower than before, their steps deliberate, their breathing shallow, even though they tried to mask it. The base commander suggested a friendly sparring session, hand-to-hand combat for the cameras. Once again, the Tavarians began well, their long limbs giving them reach and speed, but the longer the match continued, the more their precision faltered, their timing slipped, their strikes grew weaker. A human marine took a hard blow to the chest, but grinned through it and countered with a solid shove that sent the aliens sprawling to the mat. The watching soldiers cheered, though their officers kept a professional silence. Velrix helped his warrior up, forcing a tight smile, though his eyes flashed with something colder. When he glanced at the humans on the fourth day, the aliens toured a mountainous training site transported by helicopters. The thin air at higher altitude made breathing harder, even for the humans. But for the Tavarians, it was like carrying stones in their lungs. They hid it well for the cameras, but each step up the rocky trails took visible effort. By now they were sleeping longer and rising slower in the mornings, their bodies unused to constant heavy strain. On the fifth day, Velrix asked quietly for a rest day, claiming it would allow his people to better appreciate the cultural exchange. The humans agreed politely, but Dr. Sloan noted every detail from the slouch in their stance to the slight swelling in their joints. Earth's gravity was not just pressing them down, it was reshaping their limits, and she knew the breaking point was close still. The aliens believed they were in control. They laughed at meals, traded stories of past conquests, and promised that soon they would show humanity what true power looked like. They did not yet see that the planet beneath their feet was already winning the war without firing a single shot. The morning of the second set of games dawned with a bright, unclouded sky, the kind that made the stadium glare under the sunlight. Banners from both species fluttered along the walls. Cameras hovered in the air, transmitting the event to billions across Earth and far beyond in orbit. The Tavarian warriors stood together in their polished armor, their posture as straight as pride would allow. But there was no hiding the stiffness in their limbs or the faint heaviness in their steps. Captain Velric spoke to them in their own language, his voice sharp, urging them to push past discomfort, to remind these ground dwellers why the Tavarian name carried fear through the stars. The first challenge was a weightlifting display, the same event that had caused some embarrassment before Velrix had chosen his two strongest fighters. To go first, both stepped forward, their thin fingers gripping the steel bar. They lifted it with a quick jerk, holding it overhead, but their arms trembled and their knees bent more than before the invisible pull of the planet dragged against their bones and muscles. One lowered the weight too soon, dropping it with a loud clang that echoed through the stadium. The human crowd cheered not out of mockery, but with the steady rhythm of support for their own team. When the human soldiers took their turn, they moved slowly with deliberate power, holding the weight steady in the air for long seconds before lowering it with control. The difference was subtle but undeniable. The next challenge was the climbing wall, a towering structure with jagged ledges and narrow grips. The Tavarians started with the same elegance they had shown before. But by the halfway point, their pace slowed, their breathing harsh in their helmets. One slipped, missing a grip, and fell several meters before catching himself. On a safety rope, the humans climbed with less grace but steady rhythm, reaching the top. Without pause, the alien team descended in silence, their faces pale, their shoulders tight. The third event was the endurance run. 10 laps around the massive arena track. At the start, the Tavarians surged ahead, their long legs carrying them in quick strides, but each lap grew slower, their backs bent, their arms swinging with effort. The humans ran at a constant pace, one by one, overtaking the aliens as the laps dragged on. By the 8th lap, one Tavarian staggered to a stop, leaning forward, hands on knees, his chest heaving. The crowd roared as a human runner passed him without breaking stride. Velrix's jaw clenched. The fourth event, a cargo carry, seemed simple, each competitor lifting a heavy crate and carrying it across the arena. The Tavarians moved quickly at first, but the crates grew heavier with every step. In reality, the weight had not changed, only the effect of gravity pulling relentlessly. Against muscles already worn from the earlier contests, sweat darkened their armor, their breathing loud enough to be caught by the cameras. One dropped his crate entirely, unable to lift it again. The humans carried their loads steadily, their boots thudding against the ground with the confidence of those born to this pull. Velrix forced a thin smile when the event ended, but his eyes betrayed a flash of anger. The final challenge was the obstacle gauntlet, a twisting course of walls, pits, and ropes meant to test every part of the body. The Tavarians began with bursts of speed, but quickly lost ground, stumbling over walls and slipping on ropes, their bodies no longer responding with the precision they commanded on their own worlds. One of their best fighters tried to leap a pit and failed to clear it, landing hard and rolling painfully to the side. The medics rushed in while the crowd gasped. The human team completed the course with steady determination. No leaps wasted no energy. Spent on showmanship, each movement measured and effective. When the dust settled, the scoreboard told the story plainly. The humans had won more events than they had lost. But the numbers mattered less than the sight everyone had witnessed, the once graceful Tavarians slowed to exhaustion under a gravity they could not defeat. Dr. Ilara Sloan watched from the stands, her expression calm but her mind sharp. She could see the truth unfolding in front of her. The aliens were not just losing games. They were losing the image of invincibility they had built over centuries. Velrix knew it too, though he said nothing, his silence heavier than the gravity pulling at his every step as he led his warriors away from the arena, each movement costing more than he would ever admit ask. The stadium was quieter now, the roar of the crowd replaced by the low murmur of reporters and officials gathering for the final ceremony. The Tavarians stood in a line, their tall frames rigid, their armor still polished but marked with faint scratches. From the events, their heads were held high, yet their eyes betrayed the strain, every blink a fraction slower, every breath deeper than before. Captain Velrix stood at the center, his hands clasped tightly behind his back, as if squeezing strength into his own body. The human team approached from the opposite side, broad-shouldered and steady, their boots heavy against the ground. Each step a reminder that they belonged to this world. The flags of both species hung above the field. But it was clear to everyone who had the upper hand. Dr. Ilara Sloan was invited to address the crowd, her white lab coat a stark contrast to the military uniforms surrounding her. She stepped forward, her voice carrying clearly across the open air. "We have seen much these past days," she said, "two peoples testing their skill and endurance. We have seen speed, grace, and agility from our guests, and we have seen determination, strength, and resilience from our own. But there is something deeper here, something beyond the games." She turned her gaze toward Velrix and his warriors, who watched her with unreadable expressions. She spoke not with mockery, but with quiet certainty. "The truth is, this planet is not gentle. It has shaped us in ways we barely think. About our muscles, our bones, our hearts, all forged under a weight that never lifts." She gestured to the ground beneath her feet. "This gravity is not just a force. It is our oldest training ground. Every step we take, every breath we draw, is work, and over time that work becomes strength. You laughed at our pace. You saw us as slow, but here you are, the ones carrying the greater burden." The crowd was silent for a heartbeat, and then the sound swelled, applause rolling like thunder through the stadium. Human soldiers clapped, civilians cheered. Even some of the press forgot their notes to join in. Velrix's face remained still, but his jaw shifted ever so slightly. His warriors shifted uneasily. The words had struck their mark. The feed of the event was being broadcast far beyond Earth across the network of alien worlds that followed Tavarian conquests. And now they were seeing something they had never imagined: their champions winded, their captains silent, their arrogance stripped away by an unseen enemy. The Tavarians had no name for, in the days that followed, images and clips from the games flooded the galaxy, side-by-side comparisons of humans moving steadily under heavy loads and Tavarians straining under the same weight, slow motion. Replays of stumbles, slips, and falls. The once untouchable warriors looked almost fragile. Rumors spread in quiet corridors of the Empire. Whispers that perhaps the humans were not as weak as they seemed. Velrix called a private meeting with his surviving warriors in a secured room at the human facility. The lights dim, the air thick with tension. He told them in clipped words that they would return to orbit and reassess the situation. The humans were dangerous, not because of their weapons, but because of their world itself, and any further public defeat would damage the Empire's image beyond repair. There were no protests from his warriors, only silent nods and the heavy shuffle of boots as they prepared to leave. Dr. Sloan watched the shuttle depart from a balcony high above the landing pad, her arms folded against the wind. She knew this was not the end. The Tavarians would lick their wounds, and they would remember the lesson, but they would also adapt. They would study Earth, learn from the experience, and perhaps one day return stronger still. She allowed herself a thin smile, because even if they did, the planet would still be here, its unseen hand pressing down on everything that walked upon it, shaping them in ways no enemy could train for. And as long as Earth kept turning under its own fierce pull, humanity would never stand as weak as the Tavarians once believed. The Tavarian fleet broke orbit in silence, their silver hulls glinting briefly in the sunlight before vanishing. Into the black, the departure was not marked by threats or speeches. Only the quiet acknowledgement of a failed show of dominance on the ground. The stadiums were empty, the flags taken down. But the memory of what had happened in those days lingered. In every conversation, news channels replayed the most striking moments over and over: the human soldiers lifting weights with steady hands, the Tavarians faltering in the obstacle course, the stunned stillness on Captain Velrix's face. When Dr. Ilara Sloan delivered her words across the galaxy, the broadcasts had spread faster than any ship. Alien merchants in distant stations whispered about the humans who had humbled the Empire. Rival factions studied the footage, searching for weaknesses. Or perhaps for inspiration. On Earth, life returned to its rhythm. But something fundamental had shifted. People walked a little taller, spoke with more certainty. The idea that humanity could stand against powers from the stars was no longer a dream. Told in science fiction, it was a fact written in the strain on alien faces. Velrix himself sat in the quiet of his command chamber aboard the Tavarak, his hands resting on the armrests, his gaze fixed on the void ahead. The journey home would be long and filled with questions from the Empire's ruling council. He was already crafting his report, careful to downplay the scale of the embarrassment. Yet even he could not ignore the truth. Earth was not a simple conquest. Its people were not the easy prey they had appeared to be on paper. The planet itself was a weapon the humans wielded without effort in a research lab deep beneath a military base. Dr. Sloan sifted through pages of notes and recordings, her study of Tavarian physiology. Under Earth's gravity was complete, but her work was far from finished. She was already drafting protocols for future encounters with species of different gravity adaptations. She suspected that the Tavarians were only the first, and that others would come perhaps with even greater advantages in technology or tactics. She also knew that the footage of this event would act as a warning to them as much as an invitation to test their own limits against Earth's unseen power. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, turning the sky to gold and crimson, a secure message arrived in her encrypted inbox. It was not from the United Nations or any Earth-based agency. The symbols on the screen were unfamiliar, the language alien. She ran them through her translator, and the words took shape. "We have seen what you did to the Tavarians. We have a problem, and we need your help." There was no signature, no location, only coordinates far beyond the edge of known human space. And a final line: "They are coming for us. Next." Sloan stared at the message, her mind racing. The Tavarians had been arrogant, but perhaps this new race was desperate, and desperation could be just as dangerous. She considered her options. She could ignore it and let the galaxy play its games far away from Earth. But she knew better. Threats ignored had a way of finding their way to one's doorstep. She forwarded the message to the military command marked urgent. The response came within hours. A meeting was scheduled for the next day behind closed doors. The generals and diplomats would decide whether humanity was ready to step beyond its world, not as a weak and primitive people, but as defenders in a galaxy that was beginning to notice them outside. In the city streets, people celebrated in their own ways, some waving flags, others sharing stories with strangers about where they were. When the Tavarian warriors first stumbled on live broadcast, a new sense of unity seemed to hum beneath the surface, as if the whole planet had drawn the same quiet conclusion. If Earth could bring giants to their knees, then perhaps they were ready to face whatever came next. Somewhere in the cold distance of space, the Tavarian fleet continued its journey home. Its captains silent, its warriors nursing injuries both physical and prideful, and in that same distance somewhere else another fleet waited, not with mockery or laughter, but with urgency and fear. And on Earth, Dr. Ilara Sloan closed her terminal and looked up at the night sky, wondering not if the coordinates would lead her to another conflict, but how soon the stars would bring it to her doorstep, because in the galaxy, strength was never permanent, and victory was never final.